The work I'm presenting today is about an effort to map the vulnerability to fuel price increases in England, and I have to share the credit with my colleagues who are named here, of course. So speaking of fuel prices, this chart, there's a long-standing concern for fuel prices, and this chart presents fuel prices and oil prices in this country in the last 27 years. So we see there, well, a few things. They're pretty high in historical terms, in real terms. Still are. They have increased at several points, and for different reasons. In the first step in the 90s, they went up, taxation went up, then it stopped going up, and then the price of the oil market, global oil markets, went up, then went down, and the very last bit is an odd mixture of oil price rebound and then Brexit and sterling devaluation. So that's what happened. So what we see is that price increases can happen, can be quite large, can be quite sudden, and they're certainly hard to predict. So in this context, some other countries have carried out some assessment of how this would impact differently different parts of the country. We see that in Germany in 2009, in the wake of the 2008 oil price spike, and in France more recently within the context of national environmental policies. We didn't find much for the UK, which is paradoxical because there's really good data out there to do this kind of analysis. So we saw an opportunity for us to do that, even though the government wasn't doing that. These were sponsored by the national governments, by the way. In terms of academic literature, there have been a few studies following this pioneering study in 2007 by Dodson and Sipe on the Australian city, and they've created a composite indicator of vulnerability to fuel price increases, which was basically based on the idea that areas with high levels of car ownership and use and at the same time low income would be more vulnerable. It's a very simple idea, but they found a strong relation between the two in the Australian city. So basically areas with low income also tended to be more car dependent, and that compounded their disadvantage. But they also acknowledged that this is almost peculiar to the Australian city. It may be different in different cities, different countries around the world. So we were interested in looking at how that would be in England. So we tried to come up with our own composite indicator of vulnerability to fuel price increases, and to do that we relied on this conceptual framework, which is pretty standard in climate change research and research on vulnerability to hazards, natural hazards, and it's been adopted in a few studies on vulnerability to fuel prices too, which is, it sees high vulnerability as a product of high exposure, high sensitivity, and low adaptive capacity. So how do these we try to define those for the particular object of our research, which is vulnerability to fuel price increases. And for exposure, we were lucky enough to be able to use these data, which I can't tell you much about given time constraints, but it's basically vehicle test data. And we know they're comprehensive. They cover the whole of England at an LSOA level, which is pretty disaggregate. So based on that and on a whole research project that was carried out on those data, but we're able to estimate per household expenditure on fuel and to relate that to median income in the area. So that's our measure of exposure. Then sensitivity, we just use income. The assumption is that areas with lower income will be more sensitive to any increase, all other factors equal. And we see that here. So southeast, blue, definitely richer than the rest of the country, and we see pockets, concentrations of deprivation around the major cities in the north. And then the last bit is adaptive capacity, and here we rely on government accessibility statistics, which are produced for each LSOA, travel time to key services by public transport and walking. And we see that accessibility is notably particularly better around cities, as one would expect. So we add these subdimensions up into a composite indicator, which gives us this. So a big blue bubble of low vulnerability around London and the southeast, much larger than you would expect given the size of London. And low vulnerability in the city center of northern cities, but not so much, and you almost don't see Birmingham there because it sort of disappears into the red. So this is zooming in. This is London, definitely low vulnerability, especially if compared to West Midlands, West Yorkshire, and Sheffield City region. So the starting point was that the idea that in previous research they had found a strong regressive relationship between income and car dependence. Do we see the same here? Long story short, no. We find a small positive correlation between income and car dependence. We define here car dependence with the metric of travel time to key services. Here where I'm highlighting the extremes of the joint distribution, so red is bad in that it's low income and high car dependence. There's not many of these areas. They're around the East Coast and between Sheffield and Leeds somehow. And green is high income and low car dependence. That's London and a few other parts of core cities. And within northern city regions, the relationship between income and car dependence is even slightly more, slightly stronger, even though not particularly strong. So we thought, okay, we don't find a pattern of regressive city as the Australian researchers, but maybe we have a problem of a regressive country in that in this scatter plot we've aggregated up to city region level, and the size of the bubble is proportional to the size, population size of the different city regions. So we see London clearly standing out as high income and low car dependence, and the other cities clustered together at lower levels of income and higher levels of car dependence. But that's very much driven by London being an outlier here. So you may wonder, how does this relate to infrastructure? And it's a legitimate question. I was a very late invitee to this conference. But I think we've heard this morning of how transport spending is particularly focused and skewed towards London in per head terms. I'm not sure how it breaks down between public transport and car transport, but certainly from a vulnerability to fuel price increases perspective, that means throwing money to the least vulnerable part of the country to improve adaptive capacity, whereas you're giving much less money to parts of the country which are more vulnerable and will have more to gain to improve their adaptive capacity. And you may wonder what the characters from Game of Thrones do there. There's a screenshot from a website, and they were basically arguing that London is King's Landing, whereas cities in the north are Winterfell. So if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know what I mean. Also, there's maybe conversely, so we said transport investment is perhaps regressive from a vulnerability to fuel prices perspective. Conversely, I think we see also regressive cuts. So since 2011, which is the year of our data, there's been massive cuts to public transport subsidies. And these have been mapped by advocacy groups and so on. And we see, for example, 100% cut in Cumbria County Council, stopped supporting bus services altogether a couple of years ago. And that was already, in our map, it was already a pretty vulnerable area. And similarly, 33% cut in South Yorkshire, also very vulnerable. And London, on the other hand, hasn't had so much cuts. So we have, from the particular perspective I'm taking here, we have a situation of regressive investment and regressive cuts. And that's all from me, I would say.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.